Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today on November 22nd, 1963.
This is Xian Li.
And this is Ellie Hernandez.
A few weeks ago, on November 2nd, 1963, Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, was assassinated. The day prior, an arranged coup by the Vietnamese generals and President Kennedy had taken place.
Let us take a moment to revisit the course of the Vietnam War up to this point. A few years ago, Vietnam was a French colony. However, they were facing strong opposition from nationalists who were committed to transforming Vietnam into an independent country. Viet Minh was a party created in 1941 by Ho Chi Minh, a communist. Its purpose was to achieve Vietnamese independence. By early 1946, the French, the Japanese, and the British joined forces in order to defeat the Viet Minh. Truman was under heavy pressure from the British and the French to support France's efforts in gaining control over Vietnam again. At this point, the French domestic economy had become highly dependent on Vietnam. Since Truman's top priority was to revive the economy in the West, he did nothing to stop the French from moving back into Vietnam.
That same year, the First Indochina War began. Former President Eisenhower followed Truman's example in supporting the French military campaign against the Viet Minh, displaying continued tension against the dominant communism in that party. By 1954, France had become highly dependent on our economic aid, with the US covering approximately 80% of the war costs. While we had previously maintained a more neutral stance, we were already becoming heavily involved in this conflict. Despite our crucial role as a benefactor, the French failed to emerge victorious. With French forces surrounded at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, Eisenhower decided against any further intervention, although Vice President Nixon and Secretary of State Dulles urged him otherwise. Such a firm decision to avoid military intervention can be seen as Eisenhower's determination to stay in the periphery of the conflict, preventing direct involvement of the United States.
As a result, the defense of Dien Bien Phu collapsed. France withdrew from Vietnam, and the First Indochina War ended. No single president decided to go to war in Vietnam. Since American involvement there emerged from years of gradually increasing commitments that slowly expanded.
The end of the war was followed by the Geneva Conference, and Vietnam was temporarily partitioned along the 17th parallel. Our pro-Western allies came to occupy the South, with Viet Minh in the North, and France completely left Vietnam. Since this conflict ended without American participation, it seemed as if we would not become belligerent anytime soon.
The U.S. almost immediately stepped in and became the principal benefactor of the new government in South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was an aristocratic Catholic from central Vietnam. With the help of the American CIA, Diem waged effective campaigns against some powerful religious sects and the South Vietnamese mafia, which had posed threat to the authority of the central government.
In 1956, the U.S. decided to support Diem's opposition towards the elections. With almost 100% of the vote in the North and with at least some guaranteed support in the South, it was highly likely that Ho Chi Minh's Communist Party would end up triumphant. And both Diem and our government feared the possibility of Vietnam dominated by a communist regime. However, this refusal of the election required violating the Geneva Accords, which called for a reunification of the North and the South under a single government. As the United States demonstrated greater assistance, by 1956, Vietnam became the second largest recipient of U.S. economic and military aid, after South Korea.
After Diem's early successes in suppressing various religious sects in Vietnam, he began a similar campaign to eliminate Viet Minh supporters who'd stayed behind in the South after partition. His efforts were so effective that the North Vietnamese found it necessary to intervene. In response, Ho Chi Minh resumed the armed struggle for national unification. In 1959, Viet Nam Crade in the South formed the National Liberation Front, or the NLF. This group was what many Americans would later come to know as the Viet Cong. By 1960, under orders from Hanoi and with material and manpower support from the North, the NLF began military operations in the South.
By 1961, NLF forces were killing more than 4,000 government officials per year and largely extending their influence on the countryside, successfully destabilizing the Diem regime. Diem was even losing support from within South Vietnam as he attempted to overpower Buddhism and establish Catholicism as the absolute religion. Enormous anti-government demonstrations followed suit. where monks lit themselves on fire in acts of protest. This Buddhist crisis was crucial in shifting our continued faith in Diem, as the South Vietnamese president made no efforts to reform despite American pressure. Furthermore, Diem remained largely isolationist during the span of his regime. Our commitment to Diem thus waned.
By the fall of this year, President Kennedy had given tacit approval to a plot by a group of South Vietnamese groups to remove Diem. Earlier this month, generals staged a coup against Diem's government. They successfully overthrew Diem, captured and assassinated him, along with his brother, who was also his advisor. While President Kennedy did not agree with the assassination, he remained a firm believer in the domino effect and thus continued the efforts to contain communism.
This just in. From Dallas, Texas, The Flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Thanks again for joining us today. This was Xian Li
And Ellie Hernandez.